Park Bom was never the kind of star people listened to casually. From the beginning, her voice carried something heavier than technique, something fragile, aching, and instantly recognizable. Born on March 24, 1984, Park Bom would go on to become the main vocalist of 2NE1, the group that debuted in 2009 and helped reshape the sound and image of K-pop's second generation. Before that, she trained under YG Entertainment after multiple auditions, and even in her earliest pre-debut collaborations, her vocal color already felt unusual, emotional, husky, and impossible to mistake for anyone else. That is why Park Bom's story feels different from an ordinary idol rise. Because this is not just the story of fame, it is the story of a voice that made people feel something immediately, and a woman who seemed to carry that emotion both on and off the stage. When 2NE1 exploded, Park Bom did not just become one more successful member of a powerful group. She became, for many listeners, the emotional center of it. Her solo singles, You and I and Don't Cry, both reached #1 on Korea's digital chart, proving that the connection people felt to her extended far beyond the group itself. But Park Bom's story was never built only from admiration. It was also shaped by misunderstanding, public scrutiny, long absences, and the feeling that her career was constantly being interrupted by forces larger than talent alone. That is what makes her so compelling. She was never just a voice. She was a wound the public could hear. Before Park Bom became one of the most unforgettable voices in K-pop, her life already carried a certain emotional heaviness. She was born on March 24, 1984, in Seoul, and later studied in the United States before returning to South Korea to pursue music. Public profiles note that she attended Berklee College of Music, a detail that helps explain why her vocal identity always felt a little different from the typical idol mold. Even early on, Park Bom did not sound like someone shaped only by the polished mechanics of pop. She sounded like someone reaching for emotion first. But what makes Park Bom's foundation especially important is not just education or training. It is the emotional distance built into her early years. Her path toward music did not unfold inside the usual fantasy of a carefree young dreamer being discovered. Instead, it feels closer to the story of someone who had to cross space, pressure, and uncertainty before even getting a chance to stand in front of the public. She reportedly auditioned for YG Entertainment multiple times over several years before finally being accepted in 2006, which already says something important about the kind of artist she was becoming. Persistent, emotionally driven, and unwilling to disappear simply because the door did not open immediately. That persistence mattered, because even before 2NE1 officially debuted, Park Bom's voice had started leaving traces. She featured on early songs by label mates like Big Bang, Lexi, and Master Wu, and those collaborations introduced something the public would later recognize as uniquely hers, a tone that felt bruised and beautiful at the same time. It was not clean in the conventional sense. It was textured, slightly broken around the edges, and that is exactly what made it powerful. Long before she became famous, Park Bom already sounded like someone carrying emotion too large to hide. There is also something deeply revealing about the way her story developed before full fame arrived. She was not built like an idol whose power depended on flawless perfection. Her strength came from emotional color, from the ability to make a song feel personal even when millions were listening. That kind of gift can be extraordinary, but it can also make a person more vulnerable in the public eye. Because when your voice sounds wounded, people do not just hear your performance, they start imagining your pain. And maybe that is what made Park Bom different from the start. Before she was famous, before she was controversial, before she became a symbol of both brilliance and heartbreak, she was already becoming the kind of artist whose greatest strength and greatest fragility would come from the exact same place. Her ability to feel everything so intensely that the audience could hear it too. When 2NE1 debuted in 2009, K-pop was not prepared for what the group represented. They were bold, unconventional, fierce, and emotionally sharp in a way that instantly separated them from many of their peers. But inside that explosive image, Park Bom occupied a very different emotional space. While Toonie as a group projected confidence, rebellion, and force, Bom often felt like the ache inside the chaos, the voice that made the power feel human. That is what made her so unforgettable. Park Bom was not simply the main vocalist of Toonie. She was the member whose voice could make even the biggest, loudest songs suddenly feel personal. There was always something vulnerable in the way she sang, as if every note carried a memory. Her tone did not just add melody to the group's sound, it gave the music emotional consequence. In a group filled with huge personalities and undeniable stage power, Bom became the emotional fracture line, the place where strength and sadness met. And the public responded to that immediately. Her solo single, You and I, released in 2009, became a massive hit and topped the charts, proving that her appeal did not depend only on Toonie's brand. Then came Don't Cry in 2011, another one song, deepening the image the public already had of her. Park Bom as an artist whose voice could turn heartbreak into something beautiful. These were not just successful singles. They were confirmations that people were emotionally attached to her in a different way. They did not only admire her, they felt her. What made this era so powerful is that Park Bom seemed to exist slightly outside the normal idol fantasy. She was glamorous, yes, famous, absolutely. But she also felt exposed in a way many stars do not. The audience could sense fragility in her voice, and that fragility became part of her mystique. She was not cold, polished perfection. She was emotional intensity wrapped in stardom, and in some ways, that made her even more magnetic. During 2NE1's peak, Park Bom stood at a rare intersection. She was part of one of the most influential girl groups of her generation, yet she also carried an individual identity strong enough to stand on its own. Few artists manage both. Fewer still do it while sounding so distinct that one line is enough for people to know exactly who is singing. But there is a cruel side to being loved for your vulnerability. The more the public connects to your emotional openness, the more easily they begin to confuse your art with your entire life. And for Park Bom, that blurred line between voice, image, and personal pain would eventually become one of the heaviest burdens of all. In 2014, Park Bom's career entered the kind of collapse that does not begin with a bad performance or a fading trend, but with public suspicion. Reports resurfaced that in 2010 she had been investigated after 80 tablets of Adderall sent from the United States were stopped by customs in South Korea. She was investigated but not indicted. And YG's explanation at the time was that the medication had been prescribed in the U.S. for treatment, and that Korean treatment had not worked as effectively for her. But in celebrity culture, especially in Kpop, legal nuance often loses to emotional reaction. The moment the story became public, the damage was not shaped only by facts. It was shaped by headlines, fear, and the speed with which people turn uncertainty into judgment. Park Bom was suddenly no longer being discussed primarily as one of the most distinctive voices in K-pop. She was being discussed as a problem, a controversy, a source of discomfort. Even though the case involved medication and she had not been charged, the public atmosphere around her shifted hard and fast. That shift mattered because Park Bom's public image had always depended so much on emotional intimacy. Fans did not only admire her talent, they felt close to the vulnerability in her voice. So when controversy arrived, it did not just damage her reputation on a surface level. It ruptured the emotional bond between artist and audience. She withdrew from SBS's roommate following the scandal and entered a long hiatus from entertainment activities. And that is where the tragedy of Park Bom's story becomes especially sharp. She was not a star whose image had been built on untouchable perfection. She was loved because she seemed human, fragile, and emotionally exposed. But paradoxically, that same fragility made the public reaction even harsher. Once the narrative around her changed, people did not simply step back. Many began to reinterpret everything through the lens of scandal. Her sensitivity, once seen as sincerity, now risked being swallowed by suspicion. The aftermath stretched far beyond one news cycle. 2NE1's group activities slowed. Minzy departed in 2016, and in November 2016, YG officially announced the group's disbandment, with Park Bom leaving the agency, while the group later released one final song, Goodbye, in January 2017. For many fans, it felt like Park Bom had not simply gone through a controversy. She had been pulled out of her own career at the exact moment when her artistry should have continued evolving. What makes this chapter so painful is that it was never just about one investigation. It was about how quickly an artist can become isolated once public opinion hardens around them. Park Bom's silence grew longer. Her appearances became rarer. And the woman whose voice once felt impossible to ignore became, for years, a symbol of interruption. Proof that in K-pop, talent alone is never enough protection when the public decides to look at you through a different lens. When Park Bom finally returned, it did not feel like the comeback of a typical pop star. It felt more fragile than that, less like a victory lap, and more like someone stepping back into the light after spending years being defined by silence. In 2019, she re-emerged as a solo artist with the single album Spring, released under D Nation after signing with the label in 2018. The title track, featuring her former 2NE1 bandmate Dara, resonated strongly with listeners and topped major Korean real-time music charts shortly after release. That moment mattered for reasons bigger than chart performance. For many fans, Spring was emotional because it did not erase the years that came before it. It carried them. Park Bom did not return as if nothing had happened. She returned with all the weight of absence, misunderstanding, and lost time still attached to her image. And that made the music hit differently. Her voice, which had always sounded bruised and intimate, now carried even more history inside it. What had once felt like vulnerability as an artistic texture now felt inseparable from survival. This is what made Park Bom's return so unusual. In K-pop, comebacks are often designed as clean narratives, stronger than before, brighter than before, more polished than before. But Park Bom's appeal was never about clean lines. Her power came from emotional residue, the feeling that she had lived through what she was singing. So when she came back, audiences were not just listening for technique or trend. They were listening for proof that the part of her people loved most had survived the years of damage. And in many ways, it had. She continued that chapter with releases like the EP Re-Blue Rose in 2019, and later activity including Do Re Mi Fa Sol and Flowers in 2022, showing that her return was not a one-time nostalgic event, but a real effort to sustain herself again as an artist. Even if the scale of her public dominance was not the same as the 2NE1 peak years, the emotional meaning of her presence had changed. She was no longer simply the beloved main vocalist of a legendary girl group. She had become something more complicated and, in some ways, more moving. An artist singing after interruption, after public rupture, and after years of people wondering whether she would ever truly come back. There is also something quietly beautiful about the way fans responded to her during this era. Park Bom's return reminded people that some artists are not loved because they represent perfection. They are loved because they represent feeling, because their voices hold memory, because when they disappear, the absence feels personal, and when they return, even imperfectly, it feels like getting back a piece of time that had been lost. That may be the real reason Park Bom's comeback felt so emotional. It was not only about music, it was about restoration. Not full restoration, perhaps, because some damage never disappears completely, but enough to remind the public of who she had always been underneath everything else. Not a scandal, not a cautionary tale, not a fallen star. A voice. And once that voice was heard again, even after all the silence, it became impossible not to feel the history inside it. Today, Park Bom's story cannot be reduced to one scandal, one comeback, or even one era. She remains one of the most distinctive voices to come out of K-pop's second generation, and in recent years her story has gained another unexpected layer, 2NE1's return. In July 2024, YG Entertainment announced the group's reunion, and the members later launched the Welcome Back Tour, turning what once felt like a permanently broken chapter into something living again. That matters because Park Bom's legacy was never only about chart success. Yes, she helped define 2NE1's sound, and yes, her solo songs left a permanent mark. But what makes her unforgettable is something more emotional than statistics. She represents a kind of artistic vulnerability that K-pop does not often know how to protect. Her voice always sounded human before it sounded polished, wounded before it sounded invincible, and that is exactly why it stayed with people. There is something almost heartbreaking about that legacy. Park Bom became beloved because she made emotion audible. But the same sensitivity that made people love her also made her easier for the public to misread, judge, and wound. And still, after the silence, the fallout, and the long distance between past glory and present return, she remains standing. Not untouched, but unmistakable. Maybe that is the final truth about Park Bom. She was never meant to be remembered as the cleanest idol or the safest celebrity. She was meant to be remembered as a feeling, and feelings, especially the painful ones, are often what last the longest.